Every major empire in recorded history reaches a moment when standing still becomes more dangerous than moving outward. Borders stop feeling like protection and start feeling like limits. What looks like ambition on the map often begins as a defensive reaction to pressures already set in motion. Expansion is rarely a choice made freely. It is a response to a system that no longer balances itself. So here is the question driving this entire story. Why do empires repeatedly reach a point where they must expand just to survive, even when expansion increases their risk? By the end of this documentary, you will understand the mechanism behind that pressure. Not as ideology, not as moral failure, but as a structural process that repeats across centuries. This pattern unfolds across different eras with different flags, from ancient tribute systems to modern reserve currencies. In each case, there's a moment when internal solutions run out and external movement becomes unavoidable. That moment is not always recognized when it happens, but once it passes, the direction of the empire is effectively locked in. Now let's walk through the pattern, step by step. The instinct to expand does not begin with conquest. It begins with a math problem inside the state. In early empires, that math was grain, manpower, and loyalty. In later empires, it becomes coin, credit, and promises backed by institutions. Different tools, same pressure. The center must keep the system paid, fed, and stable. Look at the Roman Republic in the 2nd century BCE. After the Second Punic War ended in 201 BCE, Rome emerged with enormous military capacity, but also enormous obligations. Veterans expected land, allies expected protection, and elites expected spoils to finance politics. The Republic could not easily reduce its army without risking internal unrest and external threats. Expansion became the easiest way to finance the aftermath of victory. This is the first hinge. The cost of holding what you already have grows faster than your ability to pay for it internally. Garrisons, roads, administrators, and the quiet work of keeping provinces loyal do not get cheaper. They get more complex every decade. So the center starts looking outward for new revenue sources, new tax bases, new tribute flows, or new strategic buffers that reduce future costs. Empires often justify expansion as security, but security has a maintenance bill. The more territory you hold, the more border you create, and borders are expensive. When Han Dynasty pushed westward in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, it was not only about prestige, it was about controlling trade routes, neutralizing rival confederations, and ensuring the flow of horses, grain, and taxes. The border became a machine that demanded constant fuel. Now shift to a later model where expansion is not only geographic. Consider Spanish Empire after 1492. The crown took on wars across Europe while trying to govern and defend a growing overseas network. The inflow of American silver helped, but it also enabled larger commitments. Debt expanded alongside empire, and the empire expanded again to service the debt. The outward motion was not a single decision. It was a loop. That loop creates a quiet dependency. If an empire's core budget begins to rely on external inflows, then losing access to those inflows becomes existential. At that stage, expansion stops being optional. It becomes the method for preventing immediate contraction. Contraction is not just smaller borders. It is unpaid soldiers, angry creditors, and political collapse at home. The pattern is easiest to see when we strip away the speeches and look at incentives. Leaders rarely wake up wanting endless expansion for its own sake. They inherit obligations that can only be met by maintaining momentum. Each new frontier, each new client state, each new trade corridor is sold as stabilization. But the system quietly rewires itself so that stability requires more reach than before. And once that rewiring happens, the empire becomes trapped in a cycle where peace feels like stagnation. Stagnation feels like weakness, and weakness invites challenges. Expansion becomes the only move that seems to solve multiple problems at once, even when it creates bigger problems later. To understand why expansion becomes unavoidable, we have to follow the timeline where internal balance quietly disappears. In early state systems, revenue and obligation tend to grow together. As territory increases, so does the tax base. For a time, this growth feels sustainable, even healthy. The danger appears when obligations become fixed, but revenue becomes conditional. A clear shift occurs in the late Roman Empire during the 3rd century CE. Military payrolls became permanent, not seasonal. Frontier defense transformed into continuous border management. Coinage, debasement followed, not as fraud, but as an attempt to stretch finite resources across infinite commitments. Expansion slowed, but cost did not. The system had lost its elasticity. A similar structural shift appears in early modern Europe after 1648, following the Peace of Westphalia. States professionalized armies and bureaucracies. Standing forces replaced feudal levies. This locked governments into permanent expenditure cycles. Once that happened, reducing scale meant risking internal collapse. External growth became a way to delay that reckoning. By the late 18th century, the mechanism evolved again. Britain did not need to annex every territory it touched. Control over trade routes, ports, and finance achieved similar results with lower administrative cost. The empire expanded functionally before it expanded geographically. Influence replaced occupation, but the underlying pressure remained the same. The 20th century introduces a new spine to the timeline. After 1944, the Bretton Woods system tied global trade to the US dollar. This allowed expansion without formal empire. Military bases, security guarantees, and financial institutions replaced governors and legions. Expansion now moved through treaties, loans, and currency settlement, not maps. At each stage, the timeline shows the same transition. Systems move from flexible growth to rigid obligation. Once rigidity sets in, the center can no longer contract safely. Expansion shifts from opportunity to necessity. The form changes, but the direction does not. This is why empires often appear strongest right before they overextend. The visible growth hides an internal loss of options. Leaders are not choosing expansion because it is optimal. They are choosing it because other paths have quietly closed. By the time historians identify decline, the timeline has already passed its critical turn. The outward motion is no longer about gaining advantage. It is about avoiding immediate internal consequences. And that distinction matters, because it explains why expansion continues even when the risks are obvious. The expansion mechanism begins when internal revenue stops covering fixed obligations. These obligations include military payrolls, debt service, administrative systems, and political promises that cannot be easily reversed. Once these costs are locked in, the system must find new inflows. Expansion becomes a funding strategy before it becomes a geopolitical one. The next step is leverage. Empires learn to convert future control into present resources. In ancient systems, this meant tribute agreements and hostages. In early modern systems, it meant chartered companies like the British East India Company, which transferred risk outward while keeping gains centralized. Expansion now produced cash before it produced stability. Then comes financial abstraction. As direct extraction reaches limits, empires rely on credit. Borrowing fills the gap between income and obligation. This works only as long as confidence holds. When borrowing replaces revenue growth, the empire must expand influence to reassure creditors that future extraction will continue. At this stage, institutions become critical. Central banks, treasuries, and treaty organizations manage expansion without formal conquest. In the modern era, entities like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank extend influence through loans, conditions, and structural alignment. Control moves through balance sheets instead of borders. Security commitments follow finance. Trade routes, resource access, and repayment stability require protection. Military presence expands to support economic reach. Bases appear where markets matter. Guarantees are issued where defaults would cascade. Expansion becomes layered, economic first, military second, political last. The mechanism tightens when retreat becomes more expensive than advance. Withdrawing from a region risks default, instability, or loss of confidence elsewhere. Each commitment reinforces the next. Expansion is no longer about ambition. It is about preventing chain reactions inside the system. Once this loop is established, the empire is operating on momentum. Even leaders who recognize the danger face structural constraints. Budgets, alliances, and institutions are already aligned toward outward motion. The mechanism does not require aggressive intent. It only requires a system that can no longer slow down safely. To see how this mechanism operates in practice, it helps to group power by function rather than by personality. Expansion is rarely driven by a single leader. It is driven by aligned institutions responding to the same pressure from different angles. Each actor solves a local problem while reinforcing the same outward direction. First are fiscal authorities. In imperial Rome, this meant the aerarium, and later the fiscus, tasked with keeping legions paid and grain supplied. In modern systems, it is finance ministries and central banks managing debt issuance and currency stability. Their mandate is continuity. When revenues tighten, they support policies that widen the system rather than shrink it. Second are military institutions. Armies and security establishments are built around readiness, not retreat. Once force structure is scaled up, downsizing creates risks inside the state itself. Commanders argue for forward defense, buffer zones, and presence abroad because those positions justify budgets and prevent sudden exposure. Expansion appears defensive from their vantage point. Third are commercial and financial intermediaries. In early modern Britain, trading companies connected state power to private capital. In the 20th century, multinational banks and defense contractors play a similar role. They profit from stability at scale, and scale is easier to maintain by expanding networks than by dismantling them. Finally, there is political leadership. Rulers, presidents, and cabinets inherit these aligned pressures already in motion. Choices are framed narrowly. expand commitments and preserve short-term stability, or contract and face immediate backlash from creditors, voters, or security institutions. Most leaders choose the path that delays visible crisis. What matters is not intent, but alignment. When fiscal needs, military doctrine, financial interests, and political incentives point outward at the same time, expansion becomes the default outcome. No single actor controls the system, but together they remove the option of standing still. This alignment explains why expansion often continues across administrations and dynasties. Policy language changes, justifications evolve, but direction remains constant. The system rewards continuation and punishes reversal long before collapse is visible to the public. Every expansion cycle contains a moment when reversal stops being realistic. This point of no return is not announced. It appears as a technical decision, often framed as temporary or unavoidable, but once taken, it closes off alternatives that previously existed. In the late Roman Empire, this moment arrived when military payrolls were fully monetized and tied to continuous frontier defense. Once legions depended on regular cash payments rather than seasonal provisioning, the state could no longer simply demobilize without risking mutiny. Coinage policy, taxation, and territorial control became inseparable. Retreat meant immediate internal instability. In early modern Spain, the point came when royal finances became structurally dependent on American silver to service European debts. By the late 16th century, reducing overseas commitments would not have stabilized the crown. It would have triggered defaults, loss of credit, and rebellion at home. Expansion was no longer funding growth, it was funding survival. Modern systems reach this moment through commitments rather than conquest. Long-term security guarantees, reserve currency obligations, and global financial plumbing create similar lock-in. Once supply chains, debt markets, and military basing are integrated, withdrawal risks cascading failures across the system. What looks like choice becomes constraint. After this threshold, decision-making narrows dramatically. Leaders debate tactics, not direction. They argue over pace, optics, and management, but not over the underlying motion. Expansion continues because the cost of stopping appears higher than the cost of continuing, even when continuation carries long-term danger. This is why empires rarely reverse course gracefully. The system is no longer designed for contraction. It has optimized itself for reach, not resilience. By the time the point of no return is visible in hindsight, it has already reshaped every major institution that matters. The consequences of forced expansion are not abstract. They appear first as quiet distortions in everyday life. Taxes become more complex and less transparent. Prices drift upward not because of scarcity alone, but because currency systems are stretched to support obligations far from the citizen's view. The cost of empire is paid long before it is named. Labor patterns shift next. As resources are pulled outward, domestic investment thins, infrastructure ages, wages lag behind productivity. In late Rome, small landholders were squeezed by tax burdens designed for imperial scale. In modern systems, households absorb the pressure through debt, longer working hours, and reduced security. The mechanism changes, the effect does not. Political language hardens as well. Expansion requires legitimacy, and legitimacy demands narratives. External threats are emphasized. Strategic interests are framed as moral imperatives. This is not always manipulation, it is institutional reflex. A system under pressure explains its motion in terms that preserve internal cohesion. Over time, inequality widens. Those closest to expansion flows finance defense, trade benefit first. Those tied to fixed income and local production feel the strain earliest. This gap is not accidental. It is a byproduct of a system prioritizing external stability over internal balance. Public trust erodes unevenly. Institutions still function, but their outcomes feel disconnected from daily reality. People sense that decisions are being made far away, for reasons they are not meant to influence. This is often misread as cultural decline, when it is actually structural displacement. The final consequence is brittleness. Systems optimized for expansion lose tolerance for shocks. When disruption arrives, whether military, financial, or logistical, there is little slack left. What once felt like strength reveals itself as dependence. The empire has reach everywhere, but flexibility nowhere. Empires do not expand because they are greedy, reckless, or blind to history. They expand because their internal structures slowly remove the option to remain contained. Fixed obligations, layered institutions, and outward dependencies turn movement into maintenance. By the time expansion looks aggressive, it is usually defensive at the systemic level. The real story is not how empires grow, but how they lose the ability to stop.